Welcome to Dialogue. G20 economies have seen strong recovery in the third quarter. But the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development said world economies still remain below pre-crisis levels. So when will it be back on track? And as Chinese policymakers map the country's economic future, what are their priorities? To talk about these issues, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Professor John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics. And via Skype, we'll talk to Joël Rouet, chairman of the Bridge Tank in Paris, and Steve Keen, crowd-founded professor of economics on Petron in Bangkok. That is our topic. I'm Zhou Yue. But John, more than 8% of rebound in GDP among the world's 20 most strongest economies. What does this figure say about the global economy right now?
Well, it only says that it's much better than the second quarter. It's actually a rebound from the second quarter. Second quarter experienced a very steep decline. For example, in India, it's like minus 25%, right? So it's the rebound compared to the second quarter that we see in the third quarter is much better. That says that during this time between July and July, August, and the third quarter, right? The economy is much better than the second quarter. But remember, the fourth quarter, starting from the fourth quarter, we are seeing the pandemics coming back. Actually, right? We call it the second wave. So I would say it hasn't. This pandemic is not over yet. We're way not over yet. There are still a couple of months ahead before we can talk about really economic recovery. The vaccines, it takes some time for them to take effect. I would say it's way too early.
And Mr. Jouet, what do you think? The economic data, is it just a quarterly growth? It will come back because the fourth quarter we have seen the resurgence of COVID.
Well, thanks for inviting me. And, let us be so far happy with this figure, because what we call a rebound was not necessarily deemed to happen, at least not not at the same time everywhere on the planet. We could have had no rebound in some economies, which could have been more devastated by the first lockdowns. First of all, if we have 8% at the G20 level, that means all the G20 countries are experiencing a rebound. And the second point is that while all are experiencing a rebound, they are experiencing a coordinated rebound. And remember, just a few months ago, we were worried that the rebounds would not be taking place at the same time, which in the case of interconnected economies with trade, intra-firm external trade for the multinationals and coupling of economies would have been a disaster. So the fact that we have not only a rebound but a kind of simultaneous rebound is good. And I think this shows somehow that the coordination across the G20 economies has worked. So we're not yet over with this crisis. I'm not so optimistic with the future, but first of all, we have a good news with this coordinated figure.
Where it has been rebounding and how is also a big question, because according to OECD, all G20 economies have seen positive growth. France, Italy, Turkey, UK, South Africa, and Mexico posted double-digit growth. What stands out is probably India. India experienced the strongest growth, 21% rebound, but that happened after a 25% second quarter drop. That is the largest drop in history. Right. This kind of a fluctuation, is it a good thing?
Well, a fluctuation is never a good thing, and with these huge figures, it's not like a minus compensates a plus or a plus compensates a minus. A minus more than 20% means that some assets have been destroyed, that some know-how has been lost, that some companies along the way must have closed. So this will never be recovered, or this will take a long time to recover. The kind of rebound you get through consumption does not pace out for what you've lost in terms of economic structure. This is one thing. The second thing is that the second question is, at which cost doesn't come. In India, you were referring to India, Narendra Modi has put a huge stimulus package. He's put all his kind of last forces, last resources of the country have been put into this stimulus package. So we will know in a couple of quarters, maybe 3 quarters, whether this package is enough to produce long-term reforms, or will have just turned out to be a kind of a short-term stimulus package on consumption. A rebound cannot be based just on consumption. Investment, reforms, restructuring the economy just the way China is doing currently is also important.
Let's talk about India a little bit more, because according to the OECD, it has expressed confidence in India's economic performance, saying its growth is expected to compete with China. And according to Euromonitor International Global Research Company, India will lead the world with economic recovery. But still a lot of people, John, are saying India's economic rebound is not so solid because there are still problems of COVID rampaging in that country.
Yeah, well, the OECD report talking about India performing better than China, talking about next year actually, right? But this is assuming that the pandemic is gone. So if after the pandemic is gone, India is supposed to be performing better than China. That's actually harder than it used to me. I mean, India's growth figure was actually higher than China's last year, right? So pre-pandemic time, India's already growing faster than China's. And there's a reason behind this, because China's growth figure, if you can look at the historic trend, it's been climbing down steadily. It's not surprising because we're so large now, right? So of course, there's a sky is the limit, and China's growth figure is expected to come down. So I think for a year or two, India's been like 1% higher ahead of us for this period of time. So moving forward, after the pandemic is gone, assuming we're going back to normal in 2021. I would expect the same trend, that India's economic growth figure would be maybe a percentage point higher than China's.
And also, we understand the next year's economic growth will be a big question mark for the world. According to OECD forecast, the world economy would regain momentum with 4% growth next year, return to pre-pandemic levels. I think that prediction is probably based on COVID is well contained, vaccination is working perfectly well, but is that assumption probably too early, too mature?
Well, I would still give these forecasts the benefit of the doubt. I still have a lot of faith in the vaccines coming from the U.S., coming from China, from UK. If you look at the experience in 1919 Spanish flu, for example, it disappeared very rapidly. All of a sudden, just gone, right? And the economy came back with.
But it still took 2 years for that to pan out.
It's 18 months actually, 18 months, a year and a half, and we're not that far from that. We're already a year, right? So 6 months left, and we also have the new technologies that at the time people didn't have it during the Spanish flu in the 1918, 1919 time frame. With the vaccines, with the new technologies, with the quarantine, methods, with our mask wearing, social distancing, contact tracing, all these technologies, I would expect that we should be in a much better position in dealing with the pandemic this time around.
And Joe, are you similar optimistic about the world economy next year?
Well, first of all, I think John was right to go back to return to the pre-COVID-19 fundamentals, because the world growth and the G20 growth is driven by China and by India. By China because of the size of China, even if growth is slowing down structurally and had been slowing down structurally before. So after China readjusts, China will become a driver. And as far as India is concerned, the share of India in the world economy and the share of India in trade is less. But with such a high growth, the contribution to global growth by India's growth is important. And if we look back to the fundamentals before the COVID-19, I think India will be the crucial point. I'm not worried for China. I'm not too worried for the EU or for US, provided the cost of the stimulus package can be absorbed. But for India, India had structuring problems that remain. Those structuring problems are two. First of all, what we call the missing middle, the contribution of small and medium enterprises to exports is limited.
Okay.
If you look at India's exports, 3/4 of India's exports fall into products and services that represent only 30% of the world trade. So that means that for 70% of the world trade, India is under-exporting. And the second issue is restructuring the labor market. And for that, not much has happened pre-COVID, and this will be even more difficult post-COVID. So I'm globally optimistic, but the country to watch is India.
And since you mentioned the labor problem, recently there are workers in Foxconn companies in India striking against the authorities. It seems that problem will be laid bare, especially after COVID, when the poor people are more under intense pressure.
Well, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has recently announced a universal safety net, universal health, but this seems to be a kind of a last-minute, in-a-hurry policy which lacks a base, which lacks a history in the development of the country, where the structure, the machinery of the state would be supporting that. The state structure is not ready for that. The financial sector has not opened and developed into this direction either. So I think this is going to take time. This is an issue that China knows very well. Chinese reforms have been at it for the last 10 to 15 years. We know it takes time. So I'm optimistic for India in a span of time of 5 to 10 years, but the next 2 to 3 years will be absolutely crucial for India and for the rest of the world, as I said.
And who do you think will be leading the economic rebound in 2021, and in what way?
Well, I'm speaking from Paris, and I'm a European, so maybe I might be having a bias in what I'm going to say. But I really believe that the greening contents of the European package, the EU stimulus package, that it will be very important. I really believe that the fact that we've adopted a long-term 7 years joint budget is very key under-analyzed structuring reforms. The fact that the last EC European Commission Council on the 10th of December declared that it's ready to resume discussion with America, that we are currently in Europe negotiating an agreement on investments with China, on which I'm reasonably hopeful. I think this places
and there will probably
Europe
synergy coming out of from Europe, China, and America because of different political environment, especially in North America.
Well, the good thing in that is that Europe has decided not to choose. Would we have to choose, this would be a lose-lose scenario. Either North America or China would lose, and we would lose in any case. So as we don't want to have to lose in any case and by having to choose, we've decided not to choose. President Macron, Chancellor Merkel, followed in that by the leaders in Italy, in Spain, in the Netherlands, are firmly standing on trying not to choose. One recent development was against the GAFAs, trying to regulate the economy of the GAFAs, and putting that within the G20 framework. I think Europe is back in some way.
All right. Thank you, Joe. And let's come back to you, John. So China is, some say, is out of the woods, and it is on a solid path of recovery.
Right.
But will that trend continue in 2021 when the rest of the world will also be back on track? Some people would argue exports from China will decline when their economy come back online.
No, I totally disagree with that. I think the current trend is going to continue, and particularly after the pandemic, the economic recovery is going to be very strong. Think about this. We are already doing quite well in the third quarter, and I would expect the fourth quarter of this year's number will be excellent, maybe even north of 6%, maybe even close to 7%. Now, this is happening against the backdrop of the rest of the entire world is in big trouble right now, right? So we have developed all these mechanisms of containing, this imported infections and entry points, and we've done, very well with respect to that. We have a couple of small outbreaks, and quickly we've been able to contain that. We sort out the source and do this quarantine work. So now, if the rest of the world is back to normal, we don't have this hassle again, right? So. Historically, again.
But they were buying less from China because their own capacities is catching up.
No, I think Chinese exports are still very, very competitive. And besides, exports is a small portion of China's economy, 17–18% at most, right? And if you take away exports related to pandemic, for example, and if you take away even exports as a result of what you're saying, that because other countries' exports or production capacity has been affected and Chinese products have been becoming competitive, even if you take away that, I would say it's a small portion in the grand scheme of things. As a percentage of total GDP, it's very small. It could be easily made up by stronger demand in domestically, for example. And also we're doing a lot of investment as well. So if you do the calculation, I think that's a small figure. Again, I want to refer to history. Historically, after the big pandemic, the economy is usually very strong, and it's very strong for an extended period of time, actually.
Also about the priority of China's economic work in 2021, because this weekend China will have an economic work conference.
Right, it's very important. Right.
And then there are several messages that are already being spreading around. One is that we will not only focus on structural reform of supply, but also demand.
Demand side, right.
What do you mean, what do they mean by demand side reform? What kind of demand will there be?
Well, I think the demand side reform really means it's the adjustments of demand in certain ways that satisfy consumers. I think our overall consumption pattern is going through an upgrade trend, and also they also emphasized, for example, on the importance of industrial production. As well as innovation-led growth. So these are the areas that are going to be heavily emphasized. I think the adjustment of demand is long overdue. I think we have seen so far is that mostly for what we call supply side adjustment. Supply side adjustment really means curtailing capacity, actually. You understand, right? So I think we're now switching to the mode of trying to create more demand, trying to optimize demand such that these capacities can be absorbed and the mismatch between demand and supply at an aggregate level could be mitigated.
And Steve, what do you think of China's economic policy messages? One is demand side reform. The other we'll talk about later probably is anti-monopoly.
I'm actually more in favor of the former than the latter. I think the negative picture that monopolies have is partly due to a bad economic theory. You get monopolies where economies of scale are overwhelming, and that applies in quite a few industries. But I think in general, China has to reorient itself towards more domestic consumption, less reliance upon exports. It's achieved its industrialization objectives well and truly from those that were set by Deng Xiaoping so many years ago now, and it's now a chance to focus upon China for Chinese needs rather than actually needing the export dollar as much as used to be the case.
And the recent pact signed between Asia-Pacific economies, what we call RCEP, will that be helpful to boost consumptions here in China? What does it mean for the other economies, Steve?
Well, I think anything that has China working on a regional basis is better than the focus upon international trade. We're going to go through some serious changes courtesy of climate change, and they'll force us to cut back on massive sources of carbon dioxide rapidly, and one of those is international trade with container vessels and bulk shipping, which is a large component of our carbon footprint for the planet as a whole. That has to go. And I think in that case, focusing upon more of a regional emphasis, less travel, less shipping of goods is better for the planet, and that will also be better for China.
I still want to talk about the anti-monopoly policies that we've seen recently. Let's first hear your thoughts, John, because the Chinese tech companies, they've been enjoying remarkable progress thanks to very lenient, should I say, regulation environment. That's why they've grown bigger. That's why they've brought a lot of profits and also convenience for consumers. Why is it necessary to regulate them?
Yeah, I'm exploring that actually. I'm also involved in a lawsuit right now, in somewhat related to that. I think it is a historical background. We have an anti-monopoly statute that was enacted in 2008. It's been almost 12 years so far. And historically, the regulatory authorities have been, the competition authorities have been taking sort of a very convenient attitude towards the growth of these internet companies. We're mostly talking about these internet companies, the big players, what's described as the platform companies, right? So what these platform companies...
Because we wanted to see rapid growth.
Well, first of all, we want to see, this is a new phenomenon, we want to cultivate sort of a new technology development, and it's also actually a very important argument, what's called the dynamic competition. It's kind of a Schumpeterian argument that in this industry there's no market equilibrium. It's competition, cutthroat competition. It's a winner takes all kind of argument. And also there's also what Schumpeter's been saying is the perennial gale of disruptive creation, right?
But have we passed the stage it is
that's what
more destructive than creative at this moment?
That's what I'm talking about. Now we are starting to see these companies becoming bigger and bigger. Not only they are becoming bigger, they are also expanding into related areas, right? You start out with e-commerce. Now you're getting to payment. You're getting to fast delivery. You're getting to inventory management, and then advertising. Now we're making loans.
So they're
getting to the banking business.
Challenges to systematic stability.
I think at a certain point we need to draw a line in the sand that enough is enough. Because they're not only becoming so big, they're becoming so big in many other areas, right? So they're becoming like an infrastructure company. So with respect to infrastructure company, that it's really concerning national economic security at this point.
But if it's a good infrastructure, why should we keep it down?
Well, because of lack of competition, because of some of the practices that are subject to dispute. I'm involved in one lawsuit right now that's concerning a kind of a behavior adopted by one very large company. That's very questionable, right? So it's the term in our field is called abuse of market dominance, basically. Article 17 of anti-monopoly law. There are certain behaviors that other companies can do, but you as a company that enjoys market dominance, no, you cannot do that. It's kind of this kind of things that ultimately it's really the harm to competition that's questionable here.
Interesting. And Steve, it seems that you have some other thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, economic theory pushes this vision that the best market is a market with lots of very small firms, and that fits their model of power dispersal. When you look at the real world and say, would that actually be more efficient? Imagine 100 Googles or 1,000 Facebooks. The network effect that we get from aggregation is actually strongly beneficial, quite frequently to consumers. Plus also, when you look at where competition actually comes from, it doesn't come from a myriad of small firms all much the same size. It tends to come from one small firm seeing an enormous opportunity that is only presented by the fact that there's a big one there in the first place. And so I think the Schumpeterian vision your other speaker is mentioning is quite the correct way to think about it. You want to have a system where there's innovation occurring regularly, and the blanket idea that getting rid of monopolies will improve the economy actually is totally tangential to the idea of enhancing technological innovation. So I think we should throw out the American approach to that, but do look at things like market dominance and often the need to regulate some of these structures.
And it's become a global practice, not only here in China, in Europe and North America, they've all been trying to ring in those big conglomerates.
Well, we have to be very careful. Now, I'm not saying that monopoly by itself is not illegal. Okay, let's put it this way. Monopoly by itself it can happen in many ways. It can happen because of patent. It could happen because of luck. For example, Microsoft came into pretty much a monopoly kind of a position because of some talents. But the point is that abuse of that position, abuse the behaviors, abuse that position.
That topic deserves a whole program to talk about. There's another thing I want to mention. That is the COVID crisis has laid bare another problem, an economic problem and a social problem. That is inequality. Because according to the UN, COVID-19 pushes millions of people, to be exact, 88 to 115 million people to the brink. And the World Bank said that 9% of the world will be living under $1.9 US per day. It seems that will be a big challenge for economic planners and decision makers all over the world, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, inequality has been, obviously the data has shown it's risen quite dramatically in the last 20 years. Government policy has actually probably made that worse, particularly quantitative easing, for example, has made the wealthy wealthier. And so we have had a huge number of policies that pretend we live in a meritocracy, when in fact there's enormous inequality coming out of power. And the power that particularly causes that is the power of the financial sector. So I'm pleased to see a focus on inequality, but a much faster way to reduce that inequality is to reduce the level of private debt through what I've called the modern debt jubilee. And I think that's necessary now to avoid a financial crisis after COVID, particularly for countries like America and Europe, which have handled it so badly.
And John, do you think China is also facing the problem of growing inequality, and that will affect policy?
This is a universal problem. It's also a historic problem. Again, I want to refer back to history. After 1918 Spanish flu, there's a distributional effect that economists have detected. What it means is that the more advanced economies did very well, the poor economists did poorly, the rich people did much better, the poor people did much better. President-elect Joe Biden was talking about that K-shaped recovery, right? He said K-shaped recovery. That's what he's talking about. In America, there are people who are doing very well, there are people who actually doing not bad. I think, to some extent, this is also happening in China. I think, we're starting to see these things happening. People who, usually they are relatively, not wealthy, they are poor people. The working class people, they tend to...
But will the policy makers have that in mind?
I think that's very important. I think this is exactly the point. I think we should learn from the history to learn that lesson that there's this K-shaped recovery thing, that helping the poor, helping the people really struggling right now is part of the policy agenda.
Yeah.
And I think it's absolutely, I'm convinced that we're fortunate that we have a government that's having this in mind.
All right.
The president is talking about people-centered economic growth. So these people are certainly on his mind.
Growth important and distribution is also important. Thank you very much, John, and thank you, Steve. And you've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Zhou in Beijing. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye. Science has never been more important than now. What is the major difference of being a scientist from being an average person?
Scientists, they are working on what we do not know.
A good scientist is wrong 90% of the time, and a really good scientist is wrong 99% of the time.
What is scientific spirit?
Ability to judge scientifically, judge correctly.
Science is the discovery of the truth.
Science needs to be a problem solver. Science can enlighten our life.